Hi, my name is Nina McCune. I am an assistant professor of history at Baton Rouge Community College. I am making this video to offer a glimpse into my classroom by giving you a sample lecture. This video will have no transcript, but it will have PowerPoint slides that I would use in my typical classroom. I always begin my class talking about what we did in the last class. So for example, for this Chapter 8, America Secedes from the Empire, I would review with my students that we covered the various acts that angered the colonists that led to their demand for independence. In the last class, we also covered some primary sources, one of which was John Dickinson's Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer. I would ask my students then a variety of questions about what they remember of how Dickinson defines liberty and how they see him as a patriot according to the terminology of the day. I then give my students an overview of what we will be doing in class today. So for example, here we would be taking a textbook quiz, having a lecture on the chapter, and concluding the class with a lecture chapter. For the lecture quiz, it's usually 5 questions, multiple choice, and then the answers are given in class with attendant page numbers so students can immediately know the progress that they have for each chapter. Lectures I like to keep relatively short and interactive, and I also like to have my own types of graphics. So for example here, for the Revolutionary War, one of the discussions that we enter into is a variety of sets of rights and the justification for the revolution in the first place. This is one of the projects of the Enlightenment, as you will. And we need to separate then the achievements and the aims of the First Continental Congress from the Second Continental Congress, as those were the bodies that set out justifying a revolution in the first place. So for example, if we then go on to talk about the First Continental Congress, there's a number of items that were achieved by this body. So for example, they sought to redress colonial grievances rather than demanding on separation. They set about as the first convention of colonial representatives after the failed attempt of the Albany Union of 1754. They also adopted a Declaration of Rights and Grievances that was forwarded then to England rather unresponsively. And one of the major accomplishments then also was the development of what was called the Association then to continue to monitor English behavior. In this next slide, because of the software that I'm using for this video, I cannot animate it the way that I typically would. But I introduced some key figures of the First Continental Congress, including Edmund Randolph, the secretary, Joseph Galloway, who was a one-time visitor to the Continental Congress. He was a Tory who then later moved to England. John Jay, our first Supreme Court Justice, for example, is there. And of course, Patrick Henry is a figure that most students can readily identify. Something that may surprise them, though, is that Patrick Henry was the first to call for a new independent government. And he was of a slim majority. He had to fight against voices like Galloway, who really wanted to reconcile with British government. We then talk about that there are 4 main political factions within the First Continental Congress: loyalists, those who were neutral, those who were moderate, and those who were considered radical, like Henry himself. We go on then to consider their accomplishments, that this Congress endorsed the Suffolk Resolves and encouraged boycotting of British goods, and also wrote the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. This Continental Congress also began to consider a variety of intercontinental alliances that it could rely on in case of further developments. Again, they would boycott British goods. They would then, in their own wisdom, continue to form committees to study problems, and they agreed to meet again in 1775. We know that 1775 meeting to be called the Second Continental Congress, also held in Philadelphia, but on a much hotter and stuffier occasion. Again, we see the delegates as arriving with no clear vision of independence, and they continue to draft appeals to the King of England and to Parliament to rectify the arguments that are ever increasing. They also opt during the Second Continental Congress, very importantly, to raise money to build a defense, including an army and a navy. They eventually craft a resolution for independence and the Articles of Confederation. Both of these documents are in fact the key to the justification for the Revolutionary War. Similarly, then we go on to talk about this group of patriots, no longer factionalized amongst the neutral parties, the moderate parties, and so on. They are now collectivized as a patriot group, as an American identity. In the image that I use, we refer back to John Dickinson, whom we read in the last class. We see George Washington standing in his Virginia military uniform, along with other key figures, Edmund Randolph again, presiding over the Congress, along with John Hancock, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson. After reviewing a number of the achievements of the Second Continental Congress, we then go on to talk about their continued quest for having justification for the revolution. And so this is a sample of a lecture that I would give to my students. As you can see, I base it heavily on animations, and there are periods of time then for student engagement, for reflection, for questions. Every class that I have will ultimately end somehow with a lecture quiz. This is some type of a reflective question that students can free-form write. So for example here, historians have argued for many years over why the revolution occurred. In your opinion, what school of thought is the most convincing and why? Students will have approximately 10 minutes at the end of every class to reflect on a germane topic like this, and this would conclude an average class.